Her own mother looked at her in the eye and said, "No decent man would ever choose you." Then she smiled and handed Clara a one-way train ticket to Montana. They didn't tell her she was being sent as a joke. They didn't tell her the man waiting at the other end had asked for someone else entirely. They just packed her bags, pushed her out the door, and laughed the moment she was gone. If you've ever been made to feel like you were too much or never enough, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far Clara's story has traveled. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday morning, and Clara Whitmore found it by accident. She hadn't been looking for it. She had simply come downstairs earlier than usual because sleep had abandoned her again, the way it always did in the house on Gramercy Park, where the walls were thick enough to muffle the sounds of a family that had stopped pretending she belonged. The envelope was sitting on her father's writing desk, already opened, the letter inside, pulled halfway out as though someone had read it in a hurry and didn't bother to hide it. Clara recognized the handwriting on the outer flap immediately, formal, unfamiliar, coming from somewhere far west of everything she had ever known. She should have walked past it. She almost did. But her name was written on the inside of the letter. Not her sister's name. Not her mother's name. Her name, Miss Clara Whitmore. She stood in the cold morning light of her father's study and read every word. The letter was from a man named Wyatt Callahan, a ranch owner out of Billings, Montana. He wrote plainly, without flowery language or false promises, the kind of writing that belonged to a man who had spent more time outdoors than in parlors. He explained that he ran a cattle operation that had grown beyond what one man could manage alone. That he was looking for a wife, not a decoration, not a showpiece, but a partner. Someone steady. Someone willing to build something real in a place where the work was hard and the winters were harder. He had been corresponding with Clara's father for several months. He had been shown a photograph. The photograph was not of Clara. She read that part twice, then a third time. Her hands were completely still against the paper, which surprised her, because something inside her chest was shaking so violently she thought it might break loose entirely. The photograph they had sent him was of her sister Josephine. Josephine, who was 22 and golden-haired, and had never once been described as anything less than lovely. Josephine, who was currently engaged quietly, secretly to a banker's son. Their mother approved of, completely a match so perfect it was being kept private only until the formal announcement could be orchestrated properly. Josephine was never going to Montana, but someone from this family apparently was. Clara set the letter down on the desk. She walked to the window. Outside, the city was beginning its morning carriages, rolling vendors, calling ordinary people, living ordinary lives, with absolutely no idea that a woman was standing 15 feet away from them, reading the blueprint of her own disposal. She heard her mother's voice before she heard her footsteps. "You were not supposed to see that." Clara turned slowly. Her mother, Margaret Whitmore, stood in the doorway of the study in her morning robe, her expression carrying the particular brand of irritation she reserved exclusively for Clara, the kind that said, "You are always inconveniencing me simply by existing." "Who made the decision?" Clara asked. Her voice was quieter than she intended, steadier too. She had learned a long time ago that showing emotion in front of her mother was like handing someone a weapon and asking them not to use it. Margaret crossed the room without urgency, picked up the envelope and tucked it beneath a stack of papers, as though the matter were already settled. "Your father and I discussed it at length," she said. "It's a practical solution." "A practical solution," Clara repeated. "You're 28 years old, Clara. You have no prospects. You have made no efforts to acquire any. This man—" She gestured vaguely toward the desk. "This man has land and income and is willing to take a wife. It resolves a problem." "I am not a problem to be resolved." Margaret looked at her with the tired patience of someone who has said the same thing so many times they no longer feel the need to say it out loud. The look itself said everything. "Yes, you are. You have always been." "He asked for Josephine," Clara said. "He asked for a photograph. He'll receive a bride. What he does with that information when you arrive is his concern, not ours." Clara felt something cold and clarifying move through her. "You're sending me knowing he'll reject me," she said slowly. "You want him to send me back." Her mother said nothing, which was the same as saying everything. The plan. Clara understood now with terrible clarity was elegant in the way that only cruelty can be elegant. Send the daughter. Nobody wanted to the man who asked for the daughter everyone wanted. Let him take one look at plain, serious, unsuitable Clara and send her right back to New York, humiliated publicly, failed with every door of possibility now closed permanently. Her family would shake their heads with practiced sadness. We tried to find her a life. She simply wasn't suited for it. And Clara would spend the remainder of her years in this house, invisible, useful, only as a cautionary tale, whispered between Josephine's friends over afternoon tea. She thought about it all morning. She sat in her room, the small one at the end of the hall, the one that looked out over the alley rather than the garden, and she thought about what it would mean to refuse. She could refuse. She was 28, not a child. She had a right to say no. But say no, and then what? Stay here. Stay in this house where her mother looked through her like glass, and her father spoke to her only when he required something, and her sister borrowed her books without asking, and returned them with pages bent, and the servants felt more at ease in these walls than Clara had ever felt in her entire life. She thought about the letter. The man's plain, direct handwriting. A partner. Someone willing to build something real. He hadn't known he was writing to her, but he might as well have been. She found Josephine in the garden after lunch, her sister sitting in the perfect afternoon light as though she had been placed there by an artist, a book open in her lap that Clara recognized as one of her own. "Did you know?" Clara asked. Josephine looked up. Something moved across her face, not guilt exactly. Something lighter than guilt. Discomfort, maybe. The mild discomfort of someone who knows they've benefited from an injustice, but doesn't intend to do anything about it. "Mother told me this morning," Josephine said. And what, Clara?" Josephine closed the book, her book with a small, deliberate sound. "What would you like me to say? That I'm sorry I didn't arrange it?" "No, you just allowed it. I don't have a choice in what father decides." "You could have told him it was wrong." Josephine's expression shifted into something that was almost pity, which was worse than anger would have been. Pity at least contained acknowledgement. What Josephine's face held was closer to resignation, the look of someone who had long ago decided that some situations were simply fixed and permanent like weather. "You'll be all right," Josephine said quietly. "You always land on your feet." "You've never noticed whether I land on my feet or not," Clara said. "That's the point." She took her book out of her sister's hands and walked back inside. She spent 3 days making her decision. It wasn't really a decision at all in the end. It was more like a recognition, a moment of looking at two paths and realizing that one of them, as painful as it was, at least led somewhere unknown, while the other led somewhere she already knew with absolute precision. She would go. Not because her family wanted her to. Not because she believed Wyatt Callahan would see something in her that everyone else had missed. She had lived long enough to stop expecting that from strangers. She would go because she was done. Done being the woman in the corner. Done being the name people lowered their voices to mention. Done watching her own life happen around her like she was a piece of furniture that had been moved to make room for something prettier. If a man in Montana was going to look at her and send her back, fine. At least she would have been somewhere. At least she would have stood somewhere new and breathed different air and been someone other than her family's embarrassment for 5 minutes. She packed one suitcase. She packed it herself without asking for help, without telling anyone what she was putting in it. She packed practical things, 2 dresses, warm undergarments, her medical reference books, 4 of them, heavy, taking up more space than the clothes, a notebook, a pen, a small wooden box that had belonged to her grandmother and contained nothing except a scrap of paper on which was written in her grandmother's handwriting, "You are more than they see." She had carried that scrap of paper since she was 12 years old. She had never quite believed it. She took it anyway. On the morning she left, her mother handed her an envelope with travel money and said, "Try not to make a scene when he turns you away." Her father shook her hand. actually shook her hand the way you shake hands with a business associate you don't expect to see again. A housemaid named Dottie, who had worked in their home for 11 years, came to the front door and pressed Clara's hand between both of hers and said nothing. But her eyes were bright and fierce, and Clara had to look away quickly before she felt something she couldn't afford to feel right now. Josephine watched from the top of the stairs. She didn't come down. Clara walked out the front door of the house on Gramercy Park without looking back. She had always believed that looking back was a habit for people who had something worth looking at. The train journey to Montana took 4 days. 4 days of watching the world change outside the window in ways she hadn't anticipated. The city giving way to smaller towns. Smaller towns giving way to open country giving way to something enormous and ancient and indifferent to human opinion. She had never seen so much sky in her life. It sat on top of everything heavy and blue and permanent, and it didn't care at all what her family thought of her. She found that oddly comforting. She ate sparingly. She slept in fits. She read all 4 of her medical books again, cover to cover, making notes in the margins, the way she always had precise methodical notes that her family had always called peculiar, and that she had always called thinking. On the second day, a woman across the aisle noticed the books and leaned over to ask what she was reading. "Medicine," Clara said, bracing for the usual response, the raised eyebrow, the small dismissive laugh. Instead, the woman said, "My daughter wants to be a nurse. They keep telling her girls don't do that." "They say that about a lot of things," Clara said. The woman smiled at her like she was a real person. Clara would remember that smile for a long time. On the 4th morning, the train began to slow. Clara pressed close to the window and watched the town of Billings materialize out of the flat, wide land, rough-edged and alive and nothing at all like the world she had come from. Buildings that looked like they were still being decided. Streets that were not quite streets. People moving with a directness that New York had but different, not the directness of ambition or competition, but of necessity, of survival. She sat back in her seat and smoothed the front of her travel dress. Her best one, which was also her least worn one, which was also, she was aware, not a particularly fashionable one by New York standards. She had packed it because it was warm and well-made, and she was not traveling to be fashionable. She opened her suitcase and touched the corner of her grandmother's wooden box. "You are more than they see." "We'll find out," she said quietly to herself. The train pulled into the station. Joel! She saw him before he saw her. He was standing on the platform with his hat in his hands, which she noted immediately, because men in New York kept their hats on as a matter of pride, a signal of status, and this man had taken his off just standing there, as though he was waiting for someone worth showing basic respect to. He was taller than she had imagined, broader. He had the look of someone whose life happened mostly outdoors, weathered in the way that's different from aged, the kind of weathered that comes from years of physical work and real weather, and not from social exhaustion. He was looking at the passengers descending from the train with an expression that was focused but not tense. Clara descended the steps. He looked at her. She watched the calculation happen in his face, the instant comparison between the woman in the photograph and the woman now standing 10 feet away from him on a train platform in Montana. She had braced for it. She had rehearsed her own stillness against it. She had told herself she would not flinch. She did not flinch. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he walked toward her, put out his hand and said, "Miss Whitmore, I'm Wyatt Callahan. I hope the journey wasn't too hard." His voice was even, unhurried. He shook her hand the way Dottie had, like she was worth the grip. "It was long," Clara said, "but I managed." "Good," he said. He picked up her suitcase, the heavy one with the books, and didn't remark on the weight, though she saw his eyes flicker with brief surprise. "I've got a wagon. It's about an hour to the ranch." She fell into step beside him. They rode in silence for the first 20 minutes, which didn't bother Clara at all. She had grown up in a house full of noise that had nothing to say. Silence in her experience was not the same as emptiness. Sometimes, silence was just two people deciding what mattered enough to speak out loud. It was Wyatt who broke it. "The photograph they sent," he said, eyes on the road ahead. "That wasn't you." It wasn't a question. Clara sat with it for a moment. She had prepared several possible responses. Diplomatic ones. Deflecting ones. The kind of careful sideways answers she had learned to construct in New York, where honesty was considered a social liability. She discarded all of them. "No," she said. "It wasn't me. It was my sister. She's engaged to someone else. My family sent me in her place." A long pause. "Why?" Wyatt asked. "Because they believed you'd send me back. And that would settle the question of what to do with me permanently." Another pause. Longer. "That's a cruel thing to do to someone," he said. "Yes," Clara said. "It is." He didn't say anything after that for a full minute. The horses moved. The land stretched. The sky did what the sky does in Montana, which is absolutely nothing except exist in a way that makes everything else feel small and honest. "Can you work?" Wyatt said finally. Clara looked at him. "I can work," she said. "Good," he said again. And they rode the rest of the way in silence, but a different kind of silence than before. The kind that has a shape to it. The kind that is less like absence and more like the beginning of something. Neither person is quite ready to name yet. The ranch hands were waiting when they arrived. There were 5 of them standing near the barn in that particular way that groups of men stand when they're pretending not to be looking at something they're very much looking at. Clara had seen that stance before at parties in New York, at church, at family dinners. The polite stare. The public assessment. She descended from the wagon without waiting for help. She stood straight. She met every set of eyes that was willing to meet hers. One of the men, young red-haired with freckles across his nose, let out a breath that was just barely not a laugh. Wyatt's voice came out like a door closing. "This is Miss Whitmore. She'll be running the household accounts and helping with the medical supplies. You'll treat her with the same respect you'd give me. Anyone who can't manage that can collect their wages tonight." Dead silence. "Good," Wyatt said. "Back to work." They scattered. Clara didn't thank him. She didn't think he wanted to be thanked. She thought he would find it condescending to be thanked for doing what was simply the right thing. She picked up her suitcase herself, the heavy one with the books, and walked toward the house. That first night, sitting alone in a small room that was plain and clean and smelled of cedar and cold air. Clara opened her grandmother's wooden box and read the scrap of paper for the 1,000th time. "You are more than they see." For the first time in 28 years, she was somewhere nobody had already decided what she was worth before she had a chance to demonstrate it. She had come here expecting nothing. She lay down on the narrow bed and stared at the ceiling and thought about Wyatt's voice on the wagon road. That's a cruel thing to do to someone. The plainness of it. The complete absence of drama or performance. Just a man saying an accurate thing because it was accurate and needed saying. She thought about her mother's voice. "Try not to make a scene when he turns you away." She thought about Josephine watching from the top of the stairs and not coming down. She thought about the sky she had seen from the train window, that enormous, indifferent, beautiful sky that did not care at all what the Whitmore family thought about anything. She closed her eyes. She did not cry. She had done her crying a long time ago in smaller rooms than this one, over smaller cruelties than this one for people who were never going to deserve her tears anyway. She was not the woman her family had sent west to be discarded. She was the woman who had chosen to come. That difference was everything. She held on to it in the dark, fierce and quiet, like a person gripping a rope at the edge of something steep. Not because she was falling, but because she had finally, for the first time, decided to climb. Outside, the Montana night was absolute and cold, and full of stars that had no opinion of her whatsoever, which was, she was beginning to understand exactly what she had needed all along. She woke before dawn on her first full morning at the ranch, and she woke to the sound of men arguing. Not loudly. Not the kind of arguing that comes with fists or broken things. The kind that happens in low, tight voices between people who believe they're being quiet, but aren't the kind Clara had learned to hear through walls as a child in the house on Gramercy Park, when her parents discussed what to do about her as though she were a financial problem and not a human being. She lay still for a moment listening. 2 voices. One she recognized as Wyatt's measured controlled with that particular flatness that she had already identified as the sound he made when he was containing something he didn't intend to release in public. The other voice was older, rougher, someone who hadn't spent any effort learning to contain himself. "She's not what you were promised, Callahan. Anyone with eyes can see that." "I know what I see," Wyatt said. "Then you see a problem. The men are already talking. You send for one woman, you get another Eastern woman no less, who looks like she's never held anything heavier than a teacup, and you expect this operation to run the same." "I expect this operation to run the way it always runs," Wyatt said, "because I run it." A pause. Heavy. "She won't last a month," the older voice said. "You know that." "I know a lot of things," Wyatt said. "What I don't know is why my ranch foreman is standing in my yard before breakfast, telling me what to think about my own household. Go check the east fence Holt. It needed work 3 days ago." Silence. Then the sound of boots on hard ground moving away. Clara got up dressed in the dark and walked downstairs to start the morning. She would not last a month. She wrote it down in her notebook, not out of bitterness, but out of something closer to documentation. She had learned a long time ago that when people told you what they expected of you, they were usually also telling you the exact shape of the thing they needed you to disprove. She intended to disprove it thoroughly. The kitchen was cold and unorganized in the way of a place that has been managed by habit rather than system, things stored where they had always been stored rather than where they made sense to be. Supplies mixed in with tools. No inventory, no record of what had been used or what was running low. Clara stood in the middle of it for a full minute, turning slowly, reading it the way she read books methodically, completely looking for the structure underneath the disorder. Then she started to work. By the time the ranch hands came in for breakfast, the kitchen had been reorganized. Not dramatically, not in a way that announced itself, just quietly made into a place where things could be found, where meals could be prepared efficiently, where the inventory which she had written out by hand in her notebook now existed as a document rather than a collective memory that lived in nobody in particular's head. The red-haired young man whose name she had learned was Pete stopped in the doorway and stared. "Where's the coffee tin?" he said. "Second shelf left side," Clara said without looking up from the stove. "It was on the table before. Now it's on the second shelf left side, which is closer to the stove, which is where you make the coffee, which means you'll spend less time walking and more time doing everything else you need to do before 6 in the morning." Pete opened his mouth, closed it, went to the second shelf left side, and found the coffee tin exactly where she said it was. He didn't say thank you, but he didn't argue either. That was enough for now. Wyatt came in last. He sat at the head of the table, the way a man sits when he owns a thing. Not out of ego, but out of simple fact, without performance, without announcement. He looked at the table. He looked at the food. He looked at Clara. "You cooked," he said. "Someone had to," she said. "Your foreman doesn't seem to consider that part of his responsibilities." Something shifted in Wyatt's face. Not quite a smile. Something that lived near a smile without committing. "Holt's responsibility are the cattle," he said. "And mine," Clara said. She hadn't planned to ask it directly. It came out of her before she could redirect it, the sheer urgency of needing to know exactly where she stood and what was expected and what the rules were. Because in her experience, the only thing worse than hard rules was no rules, which meant the rules changed depending on who needed something from you. Wyatt looked at her steadily. "That's something we should discuss." "Yes," Clara said. "It is." The hands ate in silence. The kind of silence that knows it's being watched. After breakfast, after the men had gone out to their work, Clara and Wyatt sat across from each other at the cleared table with 2 cups of coffee between them, and they had the most honest conversation she had experienced in 28 years of living. "Tell me what you actually need," she said. Wyatt wrapped both hands around his cup. "The ranch accounts are a disaster. I know cattle. I don't know numbers the way numbers need to be known. I've been losing money on paper for 2 years, and I can't figure out where it's going. Show me the books. They're not organized." "I assumed," Clara said. "Show me anyway." He looked at her with an expression she would come to recognize over the coming weeks, a look that was part assessment and part something else, something he hadn't decided on yet. Like a man who had learned to be careful about what he trusted and was now encountering something that made being careful feel unnecessarily expensive. He got up and brought her the books. She opened the first one, and it took her less than 4 minutes to find the first significant error. "You've been double paying your grain supplier since March of last year," she said. Wyatt sat very still. "What?" "Here." She turned the ledger toward him and pointed. This account was settled in full on the 14th. It was paid again on the 22nd. 8 months of double payments. If the amounts are consistent. She did the arithmetic quickly in the margin of her notebook. "You've overpaid by roughly $240. Wyatt stared at the numbers. Then he looked at her. "How did you learn to do that?" he said. Clara hesitated. It was a question nobody had ever asked her before, not because it wasn't worth asking, but because in her family's world, the things Clara knew were not considered interesting enough to ask about. They were considered peculiarities. Mildly embarrassing evidence of too much time spent alone with books, instead of doing what she was supposed to be doing, which was finding a husband. "I had a great deal of time to myself," she said simply. "I used it." He held her gaze for another moment. Then he nodded once slowly, the way men nod when they've made a decision they intend to stand behind. "All right," he said. "The books are yours." She pulled the ledger toward her and went to work. Holt the foreman came back in around mid-morning for something he'd forgotten and stopped dead when he saw Clara at the table with Wyatt's account books spread open in front of her, writing in neat columns with absolute concentration. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he looked at Wyatt, who was nearby doing his own work, and Wyatt looked back at him with an expression that communicated exactly one thing. "This is not your concern." Holt left without saying a word. Clara kept writing. She found 3 more errors before noon. Not all of them were the supplier's fault or anyone's fault exactly. Some of them were simply the result of a system that had never been designed, that had grown by addition rather than intention, where each new element was tacked onto the previous one without anyone stepping back to look at the whole. She understood this kind of disorder. She had lived inside it for years. The difference between a system that works and a system that merely continues is the difference between someone thinking about the whole and someone just getting through today. She was built for the whole. She had never been given a whole to work on before. She didn't look up from the books at lunch. Pete brought her a plate without being asked, set it quietly beside her, said nothing, and left. She ate with one hand and kept writing with the other, and didn't register until much later that it was the first time in her memory that someone had brought her food without being instructed to. That afternoon, Wyatt came to stand behind her chair and look at what she had produced: 3 hours of organized accounts. Errors marked corrections, proposed a summary sheet at the front that laid out the ranch's actual financial position clearly and without sentiment. He stood there for a long time. "Clara," he said finally. She looked up. "This is..." He stopped, started again. "Nobody has ever done this." "I know," she said. "How do you know?" "Because if someone had the books, wouldn't have looked the way they did when you handed them to me." He made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something more complicated. "Fair enough," he said. She turned back to the accounts. But something had changed in the room. Something small and significant, the way a single degree of temperature change can turn rain into something solid. She felt it. She didn't name it. Not yet. The weeks that followed established a rhythm that Clara had not experienced before. A rhythm based on usefulness, rather than performance, on actual contribution, rather than the performance of contribution. Every morning she rose before the household and organized the day's necessities. Every afternoon she worked the accounts, cross-referencing invoices against ledgers, building a system where none had existed. Every evening she sat at the table and made notes about what she had observed, what she had learned, what needed attention. The ranch hands watched her with varying degrees of suspicion. Pete moved first from suspicion to neutrality, to something approaching casual acceptance. The way young men do when they realize a thing they thought would bother them simply doesn't. A man named Douglas, older and quieter, began leaving small tasks near her workspace without comment. A broken piece of equipment that needed to be noted in the inventory. A purchase order that needed checking against the delivery. It was the frontier equivalent of an acknowledgement, and she took it as such. Holt remained difficult. I didn't do anything overt. He was too experienced for that, too aware that Wyatt would not tolerate open conflict. What he did was the particular thing that small-minded people do when they cannot attack directly. He created friction. Small, deniable friction. A task would be done in a way that contradicted the system Clara had established. A supply order would be placed without the inventory check she had put in place. A decision would be made that bypassed the record-keeping she had organized, and when she raised it, Holt would shrug and say he didn't see why a simple matter needed so much paperwork. One evening 3 weeks in, she heard him talking to two of the hands in the yard. She wasn't meant to hear it. She was returning from the supply shed, and they hadn't noticed her approach. "She's got him turned around," Holt was saying. "Man doesn't see it. She came here as a trick, and now she's running his books and his kitchen, and give it another month, she'll be running him." A pause. One of the hands, she couldn't see which one, spoke quietly. "She found the money. Garver's been shorting us, though." "That's not the point." "Holt, she found money we didn't know we'd lost. I'm just saying." "I don't care what she found." Holt said, his voice going tight. "She's not what she's supposed to be. And a ranch run on a woman's say-so is a ranch that won't be taken seriously." Clara stepped around the corner of the shed. All three men went still. She looked at Holt directly. "A ranch that loses $240 to an unchecked supplier and doesn't notice for 8 months isn't being taken seriously already," she said. "That's not my opinion. That's arithmetic." Dead silence. Then she walked past them into the house without hurrying. Inside, she stood at the kitchen counter and gripped the edge of it and breathed carefully the way she had learned to breathe when her heart was going fast and she needed her face to be still. Her hands were shaking slightly. Not from fear. From the particular energy that comes from doing the thing you were afraid to do and finding out you could do it. She heard the door open behind her. She turned around. It was Pete. He looked at her with a complicated expression, young enough to still show everything he was feeling, not yet practiced enough to hide it. "Holt's not going to let that go," he said. "Not a threat, a fact." "I know," Clara said. "He's been with Callahan for 12 years. "I know that too." Pete chewed his lip. "What are you going to do?" "Keep working," Clara said. "That's all I can do. That's all I intend to do." He looked at her for another moment. Then he nodded once with something in it that she thought might be the early tentative beginnings of respect. The confrontation with Wyatt came 3 days later. Not about Holt. She had said nothing to Wyatt about Holt, and she didn't intend to. She had learned early in life that the fastest way to lose ground was to ask someone else to defend it for you. But something had shifted between. In those 3 weeks, a subtle rebalancing of whatever arrangement had been struck at that table on her second morning, and the shift came as most significant shifts do not from a large moment, but from a small one. She was working at the accounts late one evening when he came in from outside, cold from the dark, and poured himself coffee and stood at the counter drinking it, and she could feel without looking up that he was watching her. "You're going to lose your eyes in that light," he said. "My eyes are fine." "Clara." She looked up. Something in the way he said her name, without the distance that had characterized their first weeks, without the careful formality that two strangers use when they're still deciding whether to be cautious, made her set down her pen. "I heard what you said to Holt," Wyatt said. She waited. "I'm not going to pretend I didn't hear it," he said. "And I'm not going to pretend I don't know what he said before it. It's not. Don't tell me it's not important," he said, not unkindly. "I've been running this ranch for 9 years. I know every man on it. I know Holt. And I know what I've watched happen in the 3 weeks since you've been here." Clara sat very still. "What have you watched?" she said. He set his coffee cup down, crossed his arms over his chest, looked at her with the directness she had come to understand was simply how he looked at things, not aggressively, not invasively, just with complete attention, the way you look at something that matters to you. "I've watched a woman come into a place that wasn't expecting her and make it run better in 3 weeks than it has in 3 years," he said. I've watched her do it without asking for credit, and without complaining, and this is the part I want you to hear, without once behaving like she was doing anyone a favor by being here." Clara said nothing. "My mother was like that," Wyatt said quietly. "She ran 200 acres and raised 4 children and never once acted like any of it was extraordinary. Because to her it wasn't. She just did what needed doing." He paused. "I respected her more than I've respected most men I know." The room was very quiet. "Holt's going to keep being a problem," Wyatt said. "I know. I'll talk to him." "Please don't," Clara said quickly. He looked at her. "I mean it," she said. "I need to be able to handle this myself. If you intervene every time someone on this ranch doubts me, it confirms what they think, that I'm here because you've decided to indulge something, not because I've earned a place." She held his gaze steadily. "Let me earn it. I will earn it. But it has to be mine." A long silence. Then Wyatt unfolded his arms, picked up his coffee cup and said, "All right. 2 words. Not a performance. Not a negotiation. Just a man adjusting to a truth he had heard clearly and chosen to honor." She went back to her accounts. But her hands, she noticed, were perfectly still. The turning point, the moment that would later mark the before and after of everything, came 6 weeks into her arrival on a Thursday afternoon in early November, when the temperature had dropped sharply and the men were working the north pasture. She heard it before she understood what it was. A commotion from outside, the specific sound of men moving fast and talking loud, the sound that exists in the space between urgency and panic. She was at the ledger when it happened, and she was already standing by the time Pete burst through the door. "It's Douglas," he said. "His horse, the animal went down on him. His leg is wrong. Holt's saying we need to ride for the doctor in town, but it's 40 minutes each way, and the leg. Clara, the leg doesn't look—" He stopped, swallowed. "It doesn't look right." She was already moving toward the supply room. "Bring him inside," she said. Carefully. "Who's out there?" "All of us. Wyatt, too." "Has he lost consciousness?" "No, but he's not good." She pulled open the supply cabinet, and her hands moved without hesitation over the contents, finding what she needed, discarding what she didn't, constructing in her mind the precise sequence of what would need to happen in what order. "Go," she said. "Bring him in." She heard Pete run back outside. She heard Wyatt's voice, calm, directing, organizing the men. She heard Douglas making sounds that she filed away clinically and allowed herself to feel later. They brought him in and set him on the kitchen table. The leg was fractured. She could see that immediately, and she could also see that it had not broken the skin, which changed the calculus significantly. She had read this scenario in enough detail in the medical texts she'd carried across the country. In a suitcase her family thought was too heavy, that her hands knew what to do before her mind had finished forming the instructions. She worked. She set the fracture with 2 of the men holding Douglas steady, and Wyatt standing at her shoulder watching with absolute concentration and without once questioning what she was doing. She created a splint from materials she had cataloged in her first week. She administered what she had available for the pain and explained clearly to Douglas what was happening at every stage, because she had read that people in pain respond better when they know what to expect than when they're left to fill the silence with fear. Douglas was conscious the entire time. When it was done, when the leg was set and splinted and Douglas was breathing hard but steady, his color returning, Clara stepped back and became aware for the first time that every man on the ranch was in that kitchen, standing along the walls and in the doorway, watching her. The silence was different from any silence she had experienced in this place before. Holt was standing in the far corner. His face was unreadable, but he was not looking at her the way he had been looking at her for 6 weeks. He was looking at her the way people look at something they didn't understand until they saw it with their own eyes. Pete said in a voice that was barely above a whisper, "Where did you learn to do that?" Clara was cleaning her hands. She didn't look up immediately. She thought about the small room at the end of the hall in the house on Gramercy Park, the one that looked out over the alley. She thought about the years of sitting in that room with books that nobody knew she was reading, learning things that nobody thought she was capable of using. "I had time," she said, "and I used it." Nobody laughed. Wyatt was still standing at her shoulder. She became aware of it, his proximity, the steadiness of him, the fact that he had not moved from that position the entire time she was working. She turned and looked at him. His expression was something she had not seen on a person's face directed at her before, and it took her a moment to identify it because she had so little experience receiving it. It wasn't gratitude, though it contained gratitude. It wasn't admiration, though it contained that too. It was recognition. The look of someone seeing something clearly that they had suspected but not confirmed. "That was remarkable," he said. She held his gaze. "Douglas needed help," she said. "I had what he needed." "You brought 4 medical books in a suitcase across the country," Wyatt said quietly. Most women traveling to marry a stranger they'd never met would have brought 4 dresses. "I brought 2 dresses," Clara said. And this time, Wyatt Callahan did smile fully. Actually, a real smile that changed the whole geography of his face. It was the first time she had seen it. She suspected it was not something he gave out carelessly. "Of course you did," he said. In the corner, Holt made a sound, not quite a word. He turned and walked out through the back door. Not in anger, she thought. In something more complicated than anger. In reckoning. That evening, after Douglas had been settled and checked twice more, and the men had eaten a dinner that Pete had cooked himself because Clara had already done enough. For one day, he had actually said that "you've already done enough today," in a tone that contained no condescension. Only simple fact. She sat at the kitchen table alone with her notebook. She didn't write anything. She just sat. She thought about Wyatt's face when he said that was remarkable. She thought about the way the room had felt in that moment, all those men, all that silence, all that recalibration happening in real time. She thought about her mother's voice. "Try not to make a scene when he turns you away." She had not been turned away. She had not been sent back. She had not been discarded at the station, or refused at the door, or told she was insufficient. She had been handed a set of account books and trusted with them. She had walked into a crisis and handled it. She had been told by a man who did not compliment things carelessly that she was remarkable. And somewhere inside her, in a place that had been sealed shut for so long, she had almost stopped believing it existed. Something moved. Not dramatically. Not with any fanfare. Just a small, quiet shift. Like a door that had been locked for years, finally finding that the key had been inside the house all along. She closed her notebook. She blew out the lamp. She went upstairs to the small plain room that smelled of cedar and cold air, and she lay down on the narrow bed, and for the first time since the train had carried her west out of New York, she did not hold herself rigid against the dark. She let it hold her. Outside the ranch was quiet. The men were settled. Douglas was resting. The accounts were in order. The inventory was current. The books were balanced. The woman they had sent west to fail was still here, still working. And for the first time, she was beginning to understand something that the scrap of paper in her grandmother's wooden box had been trying to tell her for 16 years. She wasn't just surviving this place. She was becoming it. Douglas healed slowly, the way bones do when they've been through something serious. Not in a straight line, but in fits and starts. Good days, followed by days where the pain came back sharp and reminded everyone that the body does not forget trauma simply because the crisis has passed. Clara checked on him every morning. Not because anyone asked her to. Not because it was part of any arrangement she had made with Wyatt. She did it because Douglas was healing under her care, and she felt the responsibility of that. The way she felt the responsibility of the accounts completely without drama, as a simple fact of what she had taken on. Douglas, for his part, said very little. He was a man of few words under the best circumstances and being laid up in a bunk with a splinted leg. While the world continued outside his window, did not improve his conversational range. But on the 4th morning when Clara came in, and he was already sitting up on his own ahead of schedule, which pleased her, he looked at her directly and said, "I'd have lost that leg if you hadn't been here." Clara was adjusting the splint. She kept her hands moving. "The doctor would have come," she said. "Not in time," Douglas said. "We both know that." She tied off the bandage, stood up, looked at him. "Then I'm glad I was here," she said simply. Douglas nodded once. Then he said, "Holt knows it too. That's why he's been quiet." She hadn't asked about Holt. She noted that Douglas had offered it anyway, which meant it was something he thought she needed to know. She filed it carefully and went back to the kitchen to start the morning. What she found when she got there made her stop in the doorway. Holt was standing at the counter. He had made the coffee. He had set out the cups. When he heard her come in, he turned and his face went through 3 or 4 expressions in fast succession before settling on something that cost him visibly, something that looked from a distance like humility. "I've been running my mouth," he said. No preamble, no softening. Just the plain statement flat as a board. Clara said nothing. "You're good at what you do," Holt said. "I saw it before Douglas. I just didn't want to say so." "Why?" Clara asked. He was quiet for a moment. A long moment, the kind where you can tell a person is deciding how honest to be. "Because I've been here 12 years, he said. "And I know every inch of this place, and I know every person on it, and I know how things work. And then you came in, and in 3 weeks you knew things I didn't know. And that's—" He stopped. "That's a hard thing." Clara looked at him for a moment. Then she said, "I don't want your job, Holt." He blinked. "I'm serious," she said. "I don't know cattle. I don't know the land the way you know it. I don't know how to read weather, or manage a herd, or make the 100 decisions you make before noon. I can do what I do. You do what you do. Those aren't the same thing." Another long pause. "I didn't think about it that way," he said. "No." Clara agreed. "You thought about it as competition. It isn't." He picked up his coffee cup, drank, set it down. Then he said gruffly in the tone of a man who is not accustomed to conceding anything, "The East pasture numbers have been off for 2 seasons. If you looked at the feed costs against the yield, there might be something there." Clara almost smiled. "I'll look at it today," she said. She did look at it. She found a pattern in the feed purchasing that pointed to a quality issue with a specific supplier. Not fraud, but negligence, the kind that compounds over time into significant loss. She had a report on Wyatt's desk by 3 o'clock that afternoon. When Wyatt read it, he was quiet for a full minute. Then he picked up his hat and said, "I'm going to go have a conversation with that supplier." "You might want to take the documentation," Clara said, and handed him a second copy she had prepared. He took it. He looked at her. He said, "You prepared 2 copies. I assumed you'd want to keep one." The corner of his mouth moved. "Of course you did." He said the same words he'd used after Douglas with the same tone. And then he left, and Clara went back to work, and by the time dinner was on the table, the East pasture problem had been formally documented. A supplier meeting had been scheduled, and the ranch's financial picture had shifted measurably towards something better. The men noticed. Not loudly. Not with speeches or formal acknowledgement. The frontier does not do things with speeches. It does things with small concrete adjustments, the way Pete started asking her opinion on supply orders, the way Douglas began saving her his best chair at the table when he was well enough to come to dinner, the way even Holt began leaving notes on her desk, actual written notes, in his cramped handwriting, about things he'd observed that he thought might affect the accounts. She was becoming part of the machinery of this place. Not because anyone had decided to allow it, because she had made herself necessary. And there is a difference she was learning between being needed and being wanted. She had been needed in New York too. Needed to be quiet. Needed to disappear. Needed to not embarrass anyone. Needed to fill a function without taking up space. That kind of need was just another form of dismissal. This was different. This need had weight. This need was real. Then the letter arrived, and everything changed. It came in the second week of November, addressed to Wyatt, from a firm in New York she recognized immediately. Hartwell and Associates, the legal firm her father had used for as long as she could remember. The name alone made something go cold in her chest. She carried it to Wyatt's desk without opening it, set it down, and stood very still in the middle of the room for a moment, doing the mental arithmetic of what that name in Montana could possibly mean. She found out at dinner. Wyatt came in late. He sat down. He ate in silence for longer than usual, the particular silence of someone carrying something heavy and deciding how to set it down. Then he said, without looking up from his plate, "Your family is contesting the arrangement." The table went quiet. Pete stopped eating. Even Holt at the far end stilled. Clara kept her voice even. On what grounds? Fraud, Wyatt said. They're claiming you misrepresented yourself, that you deceived me into accepting you in place of your sister. He looked up then. His eyes were steady, but there was something behind them, something that looked like anger carefully managed. They're requesting that I return you to New York and consider the arrangement void. The word return landed in the room like a stone dropped into still water. Pete said, "That's," and then stopped himself. Holt said nothing, but his jaw was tight. Clara set down her fork very deliberately. "Who signed the letter?" she said. "Your father, and a Mr. Alderman Whitmore. Your uncle, I assume." "My uncle is a partner at Hartwell," she said. "He drafted the language." She looked at her plate. She thought about her father shaking her hand at the front door, like a business associate he didn't expect to see again. She thought about how carefully they had designed this, send her, let her fail, and when that didn't work as planned, use the law. "They didn't expect this to take this long," she said. "What do you mean?" Wyatt said. "They expected you to send me back immediately, from the station or within the first week, when I didn't come back." She paused. "They had to improvise." Wyatt was watching her with that full attention look. "Do you want to go back?" he said. The question was direct and quiet, and completely without manipulation. He was not asking it to pressure her. He was asking because he was the kind of man who believed people had the right to make their own choices and needed accurate information to make them. "No," Clara said. "Then you're not going back," Wyatt said. He picked up his fork and went back to eating. Holt let out a breath. Pete made a sound under his breath that was mostly unprintable. Douglas at the far end of the table took a long drink of water and set down his glass with a firmness that communicated perfectly where he stood. But Clara knew it wasn't that simple. Nothing involving her family was ever simple. She had 28 years of evidence. She was right. The following week brought a visitor. His name was Alderman Whitmore, and he arrived with a hired man and a legal document, and the particular air of a man who has never in his life had to persuade anyone of anything, because the law has always done it for him. I was her father's brother, and she had always disliked him not for a single specific reason, but for the accumulation of 100 small ones. The way he talked over women in rooms, the way he used the word reasonable exclusively to mean what I want. The way he looked at Clara throughout her childhood, as though her existence was a persistent administrative error. He arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning, which Clara would later recognize as a deliberate choice. Tuesday mornings. Wyatt rode the north pasture, which meant Alderman had timed his arrival for when Wyatt was least likely to be immediately present. Clara met him at the door. He looked at her, and for one unguarded instant, his surprise was completely visible, not at her presence, but at her. At how she looked. At the directness of her posture. The steadiness of her gaze, the simple fact that she stood in the doorway of this house without apology, without the familiar shrinking quality he remembered from years of watching her disappear into corners at family gatherings. He recovered quickly. "Clara," he said, "you look—" He paused, recalibrating. "You look well, Uncle Alderman," she said. "I'd say this was a surprise, but I read the letter you drafted." He straightened slightly. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Callahan." "He's working. You're welcome to wait." She stepped back from the door. "Come inside." She brought him coffee. She sat across the table from him with her hands folded and her face composed and let him begin, because she had learned a long time ago that the person who speaks first is usually the person who is more afraid. He spoke first. "This situation has caused considerable difficulty for the family," he said. "I want you to understand that. Your father is concerned. Your mother—" "My mother," Clara said, "told me not to make a scene when he turned me away. Those were her exact words the morning I left." Alderman paused. "Regardless of the circumstances." "The circumstances," Clara said quietly, "are that my family sent me across the country as a deliberate deception, hoping I would be rejected and humiliated enough to stop being an inconvenience to them. That's not my characterization. That's what happened. and I suspect you knew about it before I boarded that train." A silence. "Clara, I'm not going back," she said. Not loudly, not with anger. With the calm of someone who has made a decision so completely that arguing against it is like arguing against gravity. "I'm not going back, and if your legal claim has any legitimacy, Mr. Callahan's attorney will respond to it through proper channels. Is there anything else?" Alderman looked at her for a long moment, and she almost missed it. It was so brief, something moved across his face. Not guilt exactly. Too late for guilt. But something in the neighborhood of recognition. The look of a man who is seeing something he helped to make and is realizing for the first time that it didn't turn out the way he expected. "You've changed," he said. "I've been allowed to be myself," Clara said. "The effect can look like change from the outside." The door opened. Wyatt came in. He was still in his working clothes, which meant someone had ridden out to tell him about the visitor, and she knew without asking that it had been Pete, because Pete had an instinct for the things that needed to be handled quickly. Wyatt's expression was neutral in the way that a held-back river is neutral. Contained, but present. He looked at Alderman, then at Clara, a question in his eyes. "This is my uncle," Clara said. "He came to discuss the legal letter." Wyatt pulled out a chair at the table and sat down. He did not take off his hat this time. Clara noted that. She understood what it meant. "Mr. Whitmore," Wyatt said, "I read your letter." Alderman straightened, rearranged himself into the mode of a man conducting formal business. "Mr. Callahan, I want to be clear that the family's concern is entirely—" "I'm going to stop you there," Wyatt said. His voice was even, unhurried, the way it always was when he had already decided something. "Your family sent Miss Whitmore to me under false pretenses. That's true, I know it. She told me the first day she arrived." He leaned forward slightly. "What I'm going to tell you is that I'm not interested in your family's legal argument, because the question isn't what your family arranged. The question is what Miss Whitmore wants, and she's told me what she wants." Alderman looked at Clara. "You're choosing this," he said. The disbelief in it was genuine. "Yes," Clara said. "You're choosing this. A cattle ranch in Montana. Over what?" she said. "Over the small room at the end of the hall. Over being handled like an inconvenience for the rest of my life." She held his gaze steadily. "Yes, I'm choosing this. I'm choosing it without hesitation." Alderman stood. He gathered his papers. He looked between them. Wyatt sitting with that contained river stillness. Clara sitting with her hands folded and her face clear, and whatever argument he had prepared seemed to disassemble itself quietly, like a structure finding its own weak points. "The family will not simply accept." "The family," Wyatt said, standing too, his full height occupying the room differently than aldermen's can respond through attorneys if they have a legitimate legal claim. "Otherwise, I'd say you've had a long ride for nothing." He gestured toward the door. The gesture was perfectly polite. "I'll have Pete see you out." All left. Clara sat at the table after he was gone and listened to the sound of the hired wagon leaving, and she breathed carefully, steadily, the way she'd been doing for 28 years when something had happened that was too large to process all at once. Wyatt sat back down. He took his hat off. He set it on the table. "They're going to keep coming," he said. Not a question. "Yes," Clara said. "What do they actually want?" She thought about it. Really thought about it, stripped away the legal language and the family pride and the performance of concern, and looked at the thing underneath. "They want to be right," she said finally. "They've spent 28 years telling each other I was worthless. If I succeed here, if I actually build something, they were wrong. And people like my family would rather burn down what you've built than admit they were wrong." Wyatt was quiet. "Can they do legal damage?" he asked. "Not much," she said. "The arrangement was their own design. My father wrote the initial correspondence. He invited the deception. A good attorney would tie that up quickly." "I'll send one in the morning," Wyatt said. He said it the way he said most things, completely without drama, as a simple statement of what was going to happen next. Clara looked at him. "You're not angry." "I am angry," he said. I'm keeping it where it belongs. Where does it belong? In the work, he said. In making sure they don't get what they came for. He picked up his hat. Which means this ranch needs to be something they can't touch. Something too solid and too real and too successful for a legal letter from New York to shake. He stood, looked at her. Which means you and I have a lot of work to do. She stood too. We always did, she said. The weeks that followed were the hardest of Clara's life, and also she would understand this later in the way you only understand things properly after they're finished, the most important. The legal threat was real enough to require management. Letters went back and forth between Montana and New York through Wyatt's attorney, a compact and precise man named Mr. Greer, who drove out from Billings twice and told Clara on his second visit that her understanding of her family's legal position was accurate to within a margin of detail that impressed him considerably. "Where did you study law?" he asked her. "I didn't," she said. "I studied how my father operated. It amounts to the same thing." Greer laughed. It was the laugh of a man who doesn't laugh often and means it when he does. But the legal situation was in some ways the easier problem. The harder one was the town. She had moved through Billings only occasionally in her first weeks at the ranch supply, runs a single visit to the general store, the brief transit of arrival. She had been aware of the attention without engaging with it the way you're aware of weather, without necessarily being caught in it. But Alderman Whitmore on his way back through town had apparently done what men like Alderman Whitmore always do when they've been defeated somewhere. He had talked. He had talked in the hotel and at the post office, and presumably everywhere he stopped for water on the way back to wherever he was connecting to get back east. By the following week, the talk had circulated back to the ranch through the reliable channel of Pete, who heard things everywhere and reported them without judgment, simply as information he thought was relevant. "They're saying she came under false pretenses and won't leave." Pete told Wyatt just loud enough that Clara, working 6 feet away, could hear every word, which was, she understood, intentional. Pete had learned discretion, but was not yet fully comfortable with it. "What are people saying about it?" Wyatt said. "Mixed," Pete said honestly. "Some think it's funny, some think it reflects on you." A pause. "Mrs. Granger at the general store says she doesn't see what the fuss is about, because the Callahan accounts are settled on time for the first time in years, and that speaks for itself." Clara kept writing in her ledger. "What about the rest?" Wyatt said. "The rest are waiting," Pete said. "Watching." "That's fine," Wyatt said. "Let them watch." What they watched over the following 3 weeks was this. Clara Whitmore walked into town. She did not hide. She did not send Wyatt or Pete to run errands she could run herself. She walked into the general store and the post office and the feed merchant and the physician's office, where she introduced herself to the doctor, a tired, overworked man named Haskell, who saw 3 counties worth of patients, and asked if he needed assistance with anything she might be qualified to provide. Dr. Haskell looked at her with the wariness of a professional encountering an amateur who doesn't know they're an amateur. "What kind of assistance?" he said carefully. "I set a complex leg fracture 6 weeks ago," she said. "The patient is healing well and is expected to have full use of the limb. I have 4 medical reference texts and working knowledge of wound care, fever management, fracture setting, and basic pharmacology." She handed him a list. She had written it out the night before of her qualifications and the sources of her knowledge. "I'm not a physician. I'm not claiming to be. But you cover 3 counties alone, and there are women and children on remote properties who don't see a doctor for months at a time. If I can be useful, I'd like to be." Dr. Haskell read her list. He read it twice. Then he looked up and said, "Can you come Thursday mornings?" That was the moment the town began to change. It didn't happen all at once. It never does in places where people are cautious with their trust, because trust is something they've paid for with real losses. But it began. A woman whose child had a persistent fever that Clara identified correctly as an ear infection, when Haskell was too stretched to ride out that far. A family 3 miles east of town, whose matriarch had been struggling with a respiratory condition that Clara researched thoroughly and brought new information about to Haskell, who implemented the change in treatment and got results he hadn't expected. Word moved. Frontier word moves differently than city word. not through gossip networks and social calls, but through the practical language of "this worked, and she helped, and the Kellerman child is better." It moves through the people who matter in a frontier community, which is everyone, because everyone depends on everyone. By December, people knew her name, not as Callahan's strange Eastern bride, not as the woman sent as a joke, as Clara Whitmore, who helped Dr. Haskell on Thursdays, who had fixed Douglas's leg, who had sorted out the Callahan accounts, who walked into town with her head up and looked you straight in the eye and spoke to you like you were worth speaking to directly. It was Holt who told her what was happening, and the fact that it was Holt made it significant. He came to find her. One evening, she was at the desk as she usually was, and he sat down in the chair across from her without being invited, which was new, and he said, "I heard something today in town you should know." She set down her pen. "The grain consortium is moving," he said. "They're organizing the northern ranches into a collective buying agreement. If Callahan isn't part of it from the beginning, we get the disadvantage rate. Meeting is in 2 weeks. Clara looked at him. "Why are you telling me?" "Because Wyatt listens to you," Holt said. "And because I should have been treating you like someone worth listening to 6 weeks ago." He said it without self-pity. A flat statement of fact, the way he said most things. "I'm saying it now." She held his gaze. "Thank you, Holt," she said. "Don't thank me," he said. "Just make sure we get into that consortium." She smiled, actually smiled, and reached for her pen. "Already working on it," she said. Wyatt attended the consortium meeting. Clara prepared his position document, 3 pages clear and precise, laying out the Callahan Ranch's production numbers, financial reliability, and the specific terms they needed from the agreement to make it worth joining. She had researched comparable arrangements in Colorado and Wyoming. Through the newspapers, she had begun systematically reading from the Billings Public Library. She did not go to the meeting. She had thought carefully about this. Wyatt was the ranch owner. The consortium was a room full of men who were being asked to enter a financial partnership, and the most effective path to that partnership did not at this particular moment in this particular place run through a woman sitting at the table. She understood the landscape. She did not resent it. She worked within it the way you work within weather, not by ignoring it, but by understanding which direction it was moving and adjusting accordingly. Wyatt came back from the meeting 2 hours later and set the signed agreement on her desk. "Best terms in the room," he said. She picked up the document, read it, nodded. "They asked about the position paper," Wyatt said. "Said it was the most professional presentation they'd seen from a ranch operation." "What did you say?" "I said I had excellent help." He paused. "I said it by name." She looked up. He looked back. "You didn't have to do that," she said. "I know I didn't have to," he said. "That's not why I did it." She set the agreement down. She looked at it. She thought about the position they were in now, the consortium agreement, the legal matter with her family approaching resolution, the accounts in order. Douglas healed the town, shifting Holt transformed from adversary to something approximating an ally, and she thought about how none of it had happened because she had been given anything. It had happened because she had built it, piece by piece, account line by account line, morning by morning, crisis by crisis. She thought about what her mother had said. "Try not to make a scene when he turns you away." She thought about what Wyatt had just said. "I said it by name." 2 sentences. 2 completely different understandings of what a woman was worth. She picked up her pen. She kept working. Because the thing she was building was not finished yet. And she had not come this far, not across 4 days of train travel and 28 years of being told she was insufficient to stop short of what she was actually capable of. Outside, the Montana winter had settled in, fully cold and enormous and indifferent to everything except the simple, stubborn fact of survival. Inside, Clara Whitmore was the furthest thing from fragile, and the woman her family had sent west to disappear was now quietly and completely, and without anyone's permission, becoming someone this territory was never going to forget. The letter from New York arrived on a Friday, and Clara knew before she opened it that something had shifted. Not because of anything written on the envelope, because of the handwriting. It was Josephine's. In 28 years, her sister had never once written to her directly. Notes left on books she'd borrowed without asking. Instructions passed through servants. Polite, distant exchanges at family dinners that were less conversation than performance. But a letter, a real letter, addressed to Clara personally, in Josephine's careful, practiced script, that was something new. Something that meant the situation in New York had changed in a way that required Josephine to do something she had never done before. Ask Clara for something. Clara set the letter on the desk unopened and went about her morning. She checked the accounts. She reviewed the consortium agreement's first month of figures, which were better than projected. She stopped in to see Douglas, who was now walking without the splint, and had recently begun light work again, which pleased him enormously, and pleased Clara in the particular way that a successful outcome pleases someone who has invested real effort in it. She came back to the letter at noon. She opened it standing up, which was how she had learned to receive information she wasn't sure about, on her feet, balanced ready. Josephine's letter was 3 pages long. The first page was pleasantries, the kind that exist purely to delay the actual subject, the conversational equivalent of clearing your throat for 60 seconds. Clara moved through it quickly. The second page was where the real information began. The engagement was off. The banker's son, whose name was Frederick, a name Clara had always thought suited him, had ended the engagement 2 months prior. The reasons, as Josephine described them, were vague. Frederick had found the situation complicated. He had concerns about family character. He had ultimately decided that the Whitmore family's current circumstances were not conducive to the kind of marriage he had envisioned. Clara read that section twice. Then she understood. Frederick's family had heard about the Montana situation, about the deception, about the legal challenge that had gone nowhere, and had been in the process of going nowhere, documented in ways that were not flattering to the Whitmore family's reputation. In New York society, reputation was currency, and the Whitmores had spent it on a scheme that had failed publicly and completely. The third page was the ask. Josephine wanted Clara to write a letter to Frederick's family, to anyone who mattered, clarifying that the Montana arrangement had been entirely voluntary on Clara's part, that there had been no deception, that the family had acted in good faith, that Josephine was entirely blameless. Clara put the letter down. She sat with it for a long time. She thought about Josephine watching from the top of the stairs and not coming down. She thought about the book. Her book closed with that small, deliberate sound. She thought about, "You'll be all right. You always land on your feet," said by someone who had never once watched to see whether Clara landed or fell. Then she thought about something else. Something that surprised her by surfacing so clearly she didn't feel the anger she had expected to feel. She felt something quieter than anger, sadder than anger. The particular sadness of looking at a person you once needed to love you, and understanding finally and completely that they are simply not capable of it, not because you are unlovable, but because they have never learned how. She picked up her pen. She wrote back. The letter she sent was 3 paragraphs. In it, she told Josephine that she would not be writing to Frederick's family. Not out of cruelty, not out of revenge, but because the story of what happened was the true story, and she was no longer in the business of protecting people from true stories at the cost of her own. She told Josephine she hoped things improved. She told her she was well. She did not tell her how well. Some things she decided did not need to be shared with people who hadn't earned the knowing of them. She sealed the letter and set it aside for the post. Then she went back to work. It was Pete who brought the next piece of news 3 days later. In the way Pete always brought news slightly out of breath, as though the information itself had been moving fast, and he'd had to keep up with it. "There's a man at the gate," Pete said. "Says he's a journalist, from a newspaper back east. Says he's doing a story on women in frontier territories." Clara looked up from the ledger. "Which newspaper?" she said. Pete told her. It was not a small newspaper. She set down her pen very carefully. "Did he say who sent him?" "No," Pete said. "But he's got a letter of introduction from someone in Billings. Dr. Haskell's name is on it. Dr. Haskell. Thursday mornings. The Kellerman child, and the respiratory cases, and the fracture that had healed cleanly and fully against the predictions of everyone except Clara herself. She stood up, smoothed her dress. Send him in. The journalist's name was Martin Elby. He was younger than she expected, mid-30s, with an alertness to his eyes that she recognized as the look of someone who pays attention to things professionally and has learned to make people comfortable enough to say true things. He sat across from her at the kitchen table and accepted coffee and opened his notebook and said without pretense, "Dr. Haskell told me about you." "What did he tell you?" Clara said. "That you've been providing medical assistance to frontier families that would otherwise go without. That you set a complex fracture that saved a man's working life. That you identified a treatment modification for a chronic respiratory case that he hadn't considered." Elby paused. "He said you had no formal training." "That's correct," Clara said. "He also said—" Elby looked at his notebook. "That you were, and I'm quoting him directly, the most practically educated person he'd encountered in 20 years of frontier medicine." He looked up. "He's not a man who gives compliments easily." "No," Clara agreed. "He isn't." "Can I ask you some questions?" "You can ask," Clara said. "I'll answer the ones that deserve answering." Elby smiled. Fair enough. What followed was 2 hours of conversation that Clara would later describe to Wyatt as the strangest interview she had ever given. Not because the questions were strange, but because answering them honestly required her to tell a story she had never told out loud in its entirety. About New York. About the house on Gramercy Park. About the small room at the end of the hall, and the books and the years of being treated as a deficiency rather than a person. About the train journey and the platform in Billings and Wyatt taking off his hat. About Douglas and the fracture, and Holt leaving notes on her desk, and Dr. Haskell and the Kellerman child and the consortium agreement. She told it plainly, without decoration and without bitterness. The way Wyatt spoke because it was accurate and needed saying. Elby wrote for most of it without looking up. At the end he said, "Your family. Do you want me to include them?" Clara thought about it. "Include what's true," she said. "I won't ask you to protect them, but I won't ask you to be unkind for its own sake either. Tell the story that's actually there." "What is the story that's actually there?" Elby said. Clara looked at him steadily. "A woman who was told she was worthless discovered she wasn't," she said. "And the place that proved it to her was the place everyone assumed would break her." Elby closed his notebook. "That," he said quietly, "is the story." Wyatt found her afterward on the porch, which was not where she usually was at that hour, and he knew immediately the way he had learned to know her moods, not through any mystical perception, but through simple, consistent attention, that something significant had happened. He sat beside her. "The journalist," he said. "Yes." "Good conversation." "Strange one," she said. "I told him everything." A pause. "Everything," Wyatt said. "About New York. About coming here. About—" She stopped. "About what it was like to be me for a long time." Wyatt was quiet. He didn't rush it. "Are you all right?" he said. The question was so simple, and so direct, and so completely without agenda, that it hit her somewhere unguarded. She had been asked variations of that question throughout her life. "Are you all right, Clara?" But always as a formality, always as a social reflex, always in a way that wasn't truly awaiting an answer. Wyatt asked it the way he asked everything, because he wanted to know. "I think so," she said honestly. "I think telling it out loud made it more finished, like it belongs to the past now instead of still happening." He nodded. "You know what this means," he said. "If that story runs, my family will see it." "Yes." "Good," Clara said. He looked at her. "Good," he said. "I spent 28 years being a story they told about themselves," she said. "I think it's time they read my version." Wyatt said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "I want to ask you something." Something in his tone made her turn and look at him fully. There was a quality to the way he was sitting, a deliberateness, like someone who has been carrying a thing for a while and has finally decided the carrying is less practical than the putting down. "All right," she said. "You came here because your family put you on a train," he said. "And I know that. And I know you've built something here that's yours, completely yours, that has nothing to do with me, or with any arrangement, or with anything except who you are." He paused. "But I want to know not what you're staying for. I know what you're staying for. I want to know—" Another pause. Longer. For a man who wasted very few words, this hesitation was enormous. "I want to know if any part of what you're staying for is me." The wind moved. Somewhere in the distance, cattle made the sounds that cattle make. The ranch breathed around them, the way it always did. Persistent, present, completely indifferent to the fact that something important was happening on its porch. Clara looked at Wyatt Callahan. She thought about the train platform, the hat in his hands. I hope the journey wasn't too hard. She thought about the wagon road, and that's a cruel thing to do to someone, and the way he had said it without drama as a simple, accurate statement. She thought about the books Of Course You Did, and Douglas and the kitchen table, and I Said It by Name, and every morning and every evening of the past 4 months, the accumulation of small, real moments that built something more solid than any single large one could. "Yes," she said. One word. She did not dress it up or qualify it. It didn't need either. His face did the thing it did when something mattered to him, went very still, and then quietly, completely changed. "Good," he said. The same word she had used, in the same tone. They sat together on the porch until the light shifted, and it was time to go back inside, and neither of them said anything else, and it was exactly enough. The article ran in the second week of January. Clara saw it first because Pete rode into Billings specifically to get the paper the morning it was published. She hadn't asked him to, which meant someone had told him to, and she suspected that someone was Holt, which would have been incomprehensible to her 4 months ago, and now made complete natural sense. The headline was simple. She had not expected it to be simple. She had expected something dramatic, the way newspapers usually were with women's stories, overwrought, condescending, tilted toward sentiment at the expense of truth. Instead, it read A Woman's Work, How Clara Whitmore Transformed a Montana Ranch and a Frontier Community. She sat at the kitchen table with her coffee going cold beside her and read every word. Elby had told the true story. Plainly, with specifics, without romanticizing, and without cruelty. The deception was in there, factually stated. The legal challenge was in there. Douglas's fracture was in there. Dr. Haskell's assessment was in there in his own words. The consortium agreement. The accounts. Thursday mornings. At the end of the article, there was a single paragraph that Clara read 3 times. It said in summary that the woman sent west by her family as an object of ridicule had become in 4 months an indispensable part of a frontier community, not because she had been given anything, but because she had brought everything she had to a place that was willing to see it. She folded the newspaper, set it down. Pete was watching her from the doorway. "Well," he said. "It's accurate," she said. "That's all you're going to say." She picked up her coffee. "That's the most important thing to say." Pete made a sound of frustrated admiration and went back outside. The reaction came in waves. The first wave was local. The town responding to seeing its own story told in print, which has a particular effect on frontier communities that are accustomed to being invisible to the Eastern press. Mrs. Granger at the general store framed the article and put it in her window. The consortium members, several of whom had been at that meeting where Wyatt presented Clara's position paper, began referring to it in conversation in ways that made clear they understood exactly who had written it. Dr. Haskell, typically sparing with his words, told Clara on Thursday morning that he had sent a copy of the article to the Medical Association in Denver, along with a formal note recommending that her case be considered in discussions about frontier medical support programs. Clara stared at him. "You didn't tell me you were going to do that," she said. "I didn't ask your permission," Haskell said without apology. "You wouldn't have let me." He was right. The second wave took 2 weeks longer. And it came from New York. She was working at the desk on a Tuesday evening when Wyatt came in from outside and set an envelope in front of her without a word. The return address was the house on Gramercy Park. Her mother's handwriting. She looked at it for a moment. Then she opened it. The letter was 4 pages long, which was 4 pages more than her mother had ever written to her in her life. Clara read it with the same methodical attention she gave the account books, not letting the surface language distract her from the structure underneath, watching for what was real beneath what was performed. What it was underneath everything was damage control. Her mother had read the article. Of course she had. It had apparently been passed around in certain New York circles. She was not specific about which ones, which meant it was the ones that mattered most to her, and the reception had been as her mother described it, with visible pain, unfavorable to the family's position. The letter did not apologize. Clara had not expected it to. It came as close to an apology as her mother was constitutionally capable of, which was a kind of sideways acknowledgement that perhaps the arrangements made on Clara's behalf had not been fully considered, which translated accurately to, "We underestimated you, and now it has cost us socially, and we would like you to help us manage that." There was buried in the 3rd page a request. Her mother would like to visit. Clara set the letter down on the desk. She turned it face down. She sat very still for a moment, her hands flat on the surface of the desk, breathing carefully. Wyatt was still in the room. She could feel him there, not hovering, not pressuring, just present, available if she needed him. "My mother wants to come here," Clara said. A pause. "What do you want?" Wyatt said. The same question he always asked. First and foremost. Not what should you do, not what's right, not what's practical. What do you want? Clara thought about it honestly. "I want her to understand what she did," Clara said. "Not to punish her, because I don't need her to be punished, but because she's going to spend the rest of her life believing that what she did was reasonable, and She stopped. "I want someone to have said otherwise, even if it doesn't change anything." "Then let her come," Wyatt said, "and say it." Clara picked up her pen. She wrote back. She told her mother she was welcome to visit. She told her plainly what the visit would and would not include. It would include the truth, told clearly, without performance or social management. It would not include pretense that the past had been something other than what it was. She told her mother to give her 3 weeks' notice so that the timing was manageable. She sealed the letter. She did not regret sending it. The 3 weeks between the letter and her mother's arrival were in some ways the most clarifying of Clara's time in Montana, because she spent them not preparing for the confrontation she had been preparing for that her whole life in one way or another, but working, building, continuing the thing she had built without slowing down or rearranging herself to make it more presentable for an audience. She finished a comprehensive financial restructuring of the ranch's supplier relationships that would save over the course of a year. A figure significant enough that Wyatt read it twice and then sat quietly for a moment before saying very simply, "Clara." She organized a small community health session at the church in Billings, coordinated with Dr. Haskell, attended by 14 frontier women who came with questions they hadn't known where to ask before and left with information they would use. One of the women pulled her aside afterward and said, "My youngest hasn't been right since the winter. I've been scared to say it out loud." Clara sat with her for 40 minutes and listened, and gave her what she had, and told her what to watch for and when to get Haskell. The woman held her hand when she left. She assisted Holt in restructuring the cattle rotation schedule, using a pattern she'd read about in an agricultural journal from Colorado. Holt's idea. "To try it," he said flatly without ceremony, which she understood was his version of "thank you for teaching me to think about this differently." She said equally flatly, "It might need adjusting after the first season." He said, "I know." And that was that. She understood living a life. A real one. With real weight and real texture and real people who needed real things and found her capable of providing them. A life where her intelligence was not a peculiarity, but a contribution. Where her seriousness was not a liability, but an asset. Where the years of sitting in a small room at the end of a hall with books nobody thought mattered had turned out to matter enormously. She was not performing. She was not managing. She was not making herself smaller to fit inside someone else's idea of what she should be. She was just living. It was the most extraordinary thing she had ever experienced. Her mother arrived on a Wednesday morning, which was not the 3 weeks she'd asked for, but 2 weeks and 4 days, which Clara noted as characteristic. Her mother had never in her life waited for a time that was convenient for anyone other than herself. She arrived alone. No maid, no companion. Just Margaret Whitmore in traveling clothes that were clearly expensive and equally clearly uncomfortable in a way that had nothing to do with the clothes. She stepped off the wagon Wyatt had sent Pete to collect her from town with specific instructions from Clara that were simply, be polite, be brief, and she stood in front of the ranch house and looked at it. Clara watched her look at it. She watched her mother's face process the gap between what she had imagined and what was actually here, which was not the rough, barely managed frontier operation she had apparently pictured, but a working ranch that showed in every detail of its organization the presence of someone who gave a great deal of considered thought to how things were arranged. The tools stored correctly, the yard clear and functional, the small board beside the front door with the week's schedule written in Clara's handwriting. Her mother stood very still in front of that board for a moment. Then she turned and saw Clara. Clara stood on the step. She did not go down to meet her. She waited. Her mother walked up. She looked at her daughter, really looked the way she never had before, and Clara held it without flinching. She had practiced holding things without flinching for a long time. She was very good at it. "You look different," her mother said. "Yes," Clara said. "You look—" Her mother paused, and something moved across her face that Clara had not seen on that face before. Not guilt, not quite, but the neighbor of it. The thing that lives next to guilt in people who have not yet found the courage to go all the way there. "You look well, Clara." "I am well," Clara said. "Come inside." She brought her mother into the kitchen. She made coffee. She sat across the table from her and looked at her with the same steady, clear attention she brought to everything, and she waited. Her mother looked around the kitchen. She looked at the organized shelves, the coffee tin on the second shelf left side. She looked at the ledger on the desk. She looked at the weekly schedule framed near the window. She looked at the medical texts stacked neatly in the corner that Clara hadn't bothered to put away. "You run this place," her mother said. Not a question. "I contribute to running it," Clara said. "Wyatt runs it. I make it run better." A pause. "The article said—" "I know what the article said," Clara said. "I was there." Her mother wrapped her hands around the coffee cup. She looked down at it. When she looked up again, her face had the particular tightness of a woman who is holding something in that costs a great deal to hold. "I didn't expect you to succeed," she said. "I know," Clara said. "I thought—" She stopped, started again. "I thought you were—" Another stop. The sentence didn't have an ending she was willing to say out loud. Clara said it for her. "You thought I was what you'd told yourself I was," she said, "for so long that it stopped being a judgment and became a fact. In your mind." She held her mother's gaze. "It was never a fact, Mother. It was just something you decided." Her mother's jaw tightened. "That's not—" she began. "It is," Clara said quietly. "You know it is. You didn't come all this way to argue about it. You came because the story has become public and the family has been embarrassed, and you want me to do something about that. I understand. That's who you are and how you operate, and I'm not saying it with cruelty." She paused. "But I need you to hear something first." Her mother went still. "I was never what you said I was," Clara said. "I was never plain. I was never unsuitable. I was never a problem to be managed. I was a person with real capabilities that you chose not to see, because seeing them would have required you to treat me differently, and treating me differently was inconvenient." Her voice was even, not angry, not trembling, just true. "You put me on a train expecting me to be destroyed by the rejection, and instead I found out what I was actually made of. And I need you to understand that I'm grateful for this life. But I am not grateful to you for it, because you didn't give me this life. You tried to take my life away, and I built this one myself." The kitchen was absolutely silent. Her mother sat across the table from her, and for the first time in Clara's memory, she did not have an immediate answer. She had always had immediate answers. In the Whitmore household, Margaret always had the last word, and the first one, and most of the ones in between. She had nothing now. Her eyes were bright. Not tears exactly, but the precondition of tears. "I don't know how to fix it," she said finally. And it was the smallest, most honest thing Clara had ever heard her mother say. Not an apology, not even close to sufficient, but real, an actual true thing said out loud. Clara looked at her. You start, she said, by telling the truth. Not a managed version of it. Not the version that's flattering to the family. The actual truth. To Josephine, to father, to whoever needs to hear it. That what was done was wrong. She paused. I'm not asking for that to fix anything between us. I'm asking for it because it's the right thing to do. And somewhere in you, you know it. Her mother was quiet for a long time. Then she said very quietly, You're stronger than I am. Clara considered that. I had to be, she said. You made sure of that. It was not the reconciliation her mother had perhaps imagined. It was not forgiveness, neatly delivered and accepted. It was something more complicated and more honest than either of those things. Two women sitting across a table in Montana with the whole true story finally on the surface between them, neither of them pretending it was something else. It was, Clara thought, the most genuine conversation she had ever had with her mother in her life. That evening, after her mother had been settled into the guest room, Clara sat with Wyatt at the table where she kept the accounts, and she told him how it had gone. He listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't offer to fix anything. He just listened, which was the thing she needed. When she finished, he said, How do you feel? She thought about it. Like something that's been open for a long time, just closed, she said. Not healed. Closed. That's different. Is closed enough? She looked at him. For now, she said. And for now is enough. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. Not dramatically, not with any ceremony. Just placed it there steady and warm the way he did everything completely without performance because it was the true thing to do. She turned her hand over. She held on. Outside Montana was dark and cold and enormous and indifferent to everything except the simple, stubborn, extraordinary fact of what was being built inside it by a woman who had been sent west to disappear and had instead quietly and entirely on her own terms decided to stay. Margaret Whitmore stayed 4 days. She had planned to stay too. Clara knew this because Pete, who could not help knowing everything that happened within a 5-mile radius of the ranch, had overheard her telling the hired driver from Billings to return on Friday morning. Friday came and went. So did Saturday. Margaret stayed, and nobody said anything about it directly, because in the Callahan household things that were true did not need to be announced, they simply were. What changed her mother's mind? Clara suspected was not any single conversation. It was the accumulation of ordinary days. Her mother watching Clara move through a morning accounts before breakfast, a supply check with Holt, who now spoke to Clara the way men speak to colleagues they have argued with and come to respect, a ride into town for Thursday rounds with Dr. Haskell home before dark to review the consortium's latest numbers. Her mother watching the ranch hands speak to her daughter without condescension or performance. Watching Pete ask her opinion on the grain order as a matter of course. Watching Douglas save her the best chair at the table because it had become simply what one did. On the third evening, her mother sat in the kitchen while Clara worked at the accounts and said nothing for a long time. Then she said, I told your father about the books. Clara kept writing. What did you tell him? That you found $240 in 8 months that the supplier had been taking improperly. A pause. He was quiet for a long time. What did he say? Another pause. Longer. He said that he always knew you were the sharp one, her mother said. He just didn't know what to do with it. Clara set down her pen. She turned and looked at her mother. Really looked the way she had been looking at people since arriving in Montana, directly without the protective layer of performance she had worn her entire life in New York. That's not enough, Clara said. But it's more than I expected. Her mother nodded once. Her hands were folded in her lap, the way they always were when she was holding something in a habit Clara recognized because she had learned it from watching her. I'm going to tell Josephine, her mother said. What I should have told her long ago, that the way we treated you was wrong. She said it without decoration, without the social language that usually coded everything she communicated, just the plain sentence, flat and real. Clara absorbed it. "Thank you," she said. "Don't thank me." Her mother said the same words Holt had said to her months ago, and the parallel struck her as both strange and fitting, that the two people most resistant to her had both in the end said the same thing when they finally came around. "I'm not doing it for thanks. I'm doing it because it's right." She left on Sunday morning. Pete brought the wagon around. Clara walked her out. They stood at the wagon, and her mother looked at her with those bright, complicated eyes that had never once in 28 years looked at her with simple pride. They were looking at her that way now. She didn't say the word. Margaret Whitmore was not built for the word. But it was in her face, undeniable, finally and fully there, the recognition Clara had needed for so long that she had eventually stopped knowing she still needed it. She found standing there in the cold January morning that it did not fix what she had thought it would fix. The wound was real. The years were real. One look, even an honest one, could not undo them. But it was something. It was true. "Take cares of yourself," her mother said. "I always have," Clara said. "I'm better at it now." Her mother got into the wagon. Clara stood and watched it go until it was out of sight, and then she turned and walked back into the house, and she sat at the desk with her accounts and her ledger and her notebooks full of careful, precise, useful knowledge, and she breathed carefully, and she let the last 4 months settle fully into her body like something that had been floating finally finding its weight. She was still there when Wyatt came in an hour later. He looked at her. "You all right?" "Yes," she said, and this time with none of the careful qualifier of "I think so." Just yes, completely. He poured 2 cups of coffee, sat across from her, said nothing, which was exactly what she needed. They drank their coffee. Outside, January continued being January in Montana. Enormous and indifferent and absolutely beautiful in the way of things that don't care what you think of them. The proposal, when it came, was not what Clara had expected. Not because it was unexpected. She had understood from that evening on the porch, from the hand across the table in the lamplight, that they were moving towards something that had a name. She had understood it the way you understand weather that's been building for a long time. Not as surprise, but as inevitability. The arrival of something that was always coming. What she hadn't expected was when. It was a Tuesday morning in February. She was at the desk. He came in from outside and sat down across from her and said without preamble, "I want to ask you something." She put down her pen. "I know why you came here," he said, "and I know that what you've built here is yours. Not because I gave it to you, because you built it." He looked at her with that complete direct attention that she had stopped trying to prepare herself for, because it moved her every time, regardless of preparation. "But I'd like to build the rest of it with you, formally, as partners." He paused. "In every sense." Clara looked at him. She thought about the woman who had stepped off a train in Montana with a worn suitcase, and her grandmother's wooden box, and 4 medical books, and a scrap of paper that said, "You are more than they see." She thought about that woman. And then she thought about the woman sitting at this desk right now, with accounts she had organized, and a community that knew her name, and a foreman who left her notes, and a doctor who had written to Denver about her, and a town that had framed a newspaper article in a store window. She thought about the distance between those 2 women. Then she thought about the fact that they were the same woman. That was the thing. That had always been the thing. She had not become something different in Montana. She had become finally and completely what she had always been seen clearly in a place that was willing to look. "Yes," she said. One word. The same word she'd given him on the porch. The same word she intended to mean the same thing she had always meant it to mean completely. Without reservation. With her whole self, which was substantial. Wyatt smiled, that real full smile that changed the geography of his face. The one she had learned he did not give out carelessly. He was not careless with it now. "Good," he said. She picked up her pen. "Now let me finish this column," she said, "and then we can discuss what a formal partnership looks like in terms of the property documentation, because if we're doing this, we're doing it correctly." He laughed. Actually laughed, a real one, full and warm. "Of course," he said. They married in March on a day that was cold but clear in the Billings church with Dr. Haskell as a witness, and Pete standing beside Wyatt with the particular expression of a young man who is genuinely moved and is doing an extremely bad job of hiding it. Holt stood in the back of the church in his best clothes, which were still clearly working clothes, and when Clara caught his eye as she walked in, he gave her a nod that contained she thought everything he was not built to say out loud. Mrs. Granger from the general store came. The consortium men came. 14 women who had attended the health session came, including the one whose youngest had finally been properly diagnosed and was already doing better. Douglas came walking fully and without pain, which she would always consider her wedding gift. Her family did not come. She had not invited them. This was not cruelty. It was clarity, an understanding that some chapters close, not with reconciliation, but with a simple, dignified ending, and that what came after was its own thing, separate and new. After the ceremony, standing in the cold, clear air outside the church, Pete handed her a folded piece of paper. "Telegram," he said. "Came this morning. I didn't open it." She looked at it. New York address. She opened it. It was from Josephine. 3 words. "Congratulations. I'm sorry. Not enough. Not close to enough for everything that had happened, everything that had been done, everything that had been withheld for 28 years. Clara knew that. She had no illusions about what 3 words could carry, but they were true. She could feel the truth in them, even through the impersonal medium of a telegram, something in the plainness of it, the absence of social management, the shortness that in Josephine had always meant she was saying something real because she hadn't given herself enough space to make it something performed. Clara folded the telegram. She put it in her pocket. She went back inside to her husband. What followed the wedding was not a softening of the work. Clara had not married Wyatt in order to stop being Clara. She had married him because he was the only person she had ever met who not only did not ask her to stop being Clara, but found the full presence of Clara to be apparently the point. The work continued. It deepened. In April, a letter arrived from Denver. The Medical Association had reviewed Dr. Haskell's submission and were proposing a formal frontier medicine support program, a network of trained laypersons in remote territories who would operate under physician supervision to provide basic care to families who could not access doctors regularly. Dr. Haskell was asked to recommend candidates for the pilot program in Montana. He recommended one. He did not tell Clara he had done it. He told Wyatt, and Wyatt did not tell Clara, and the first she knew of it was when the formal letter arrived addressed to her by name from the Denver Medical Association. She read it standing at the kitchen counter. She read it twice. Then she sat down at the table and put her face in her hands. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming pressure of something that has no other exit. The feeling of being fully, completely seen by something larger than any individual person. The institutional acknowledgement that what she had been doing alone in a small room at the end of a hall with books nobody thought mattered had turned out to matter so significantly that a medical association in Denver had put her name in an official document. Pete came in and found her like that and immediately panicked. "Clara, what happened? Is it your family? Is it?" "It's fine," she said, lifting her head. Her eyes were bright. "It's more than fine." She handed him the letter. He read it. His mouth opened. "There." He stopped. "Read it again." "They want you to." "Yes." "Clara." He looked up. His face was doing everything, every emotion he had all at once, unguarded and young and completely genuine. "Clara, this is—" "I know," she said. "Does Wyatt know?" "He knows about the submission," she said. "He didn't know about this." Pete dropped the letter on the table and ran out of the house. She heard him shouting across the yard for Wyatt. She picked up her pen and began drafting her response to Denver. The pilot program changed things in ways that rippled outward in directions she hadn't fully anticipated. 3 other women in the territory were eventually brought into the program after Clara women. She identified herself. Women she had met on Thursday mornings or through the community health sessions. Women who had that particular quality. She had learned to recognize the quality of having been dismissed for so long that their capabilities had never been properly inventoried. She trained them herself with Dr. Haskell's oversight using a curriculum she developed from her own medical texts supplemented by materials the Denver Association sent. She sat with each of them the way nobody had ever sat with her, not to evaluate them, not to assess their limitations, but to find out what they already knew and build from there. The first one was a woman named Ruth, who had been farming 60 miles east of Billings with her husband for 11 years, and had delivered 4 of her neighbor's babies because the doctor couldn't reach them in time. Ruth came to the first training session with the particular wariness of someone who has been told many times that what she does isn't real skill. Clara put a medical text in front of her and opened it to a diagram Ruth recognized immediately. "You know this," Clara said. "I've done it," Ruth said. "Just never seen the name for it." "Now you have the name," Clara said. "Now you have the documentation. Now nobody can tell you it isn't real." Ruth looked at her. "Is that what happened to you?" she said. Clara looked back. "Yes," she said. "And I'm making sure it doesn't happen to you." Ruth became within a year the most capable frontier medical practitioner in the Eastern Territory. Dr. Haskell said so himself in a letter to Denver that Clara read over his shoulder when he thought she was looking at something else. The consortium expanded. The second-year numbers were better than the first. Holt, who had become something that defied easy categorization, not a friend, not simply a colleague, but something in the specific register of a person who has seen you at your worst and chosen to grow from it, came to Clara in the spring with an idea about expanding the cattle operation that she spent 3 days analyzing before telling him it was viable, but only if they adjusted the feed cost projections in the third quarter. He adjusted them. It was viable. "You know," Holt said one afternoon when they were going over the expansion numbers together, "I told Wyatt she won't last a month." "I know," Clara said. "I heard you." He went still. "You heard me." "The first morning, through the window." He was quiet for a moment. "And you didn't say anything." "What would I have said?" Clara looked at him. "You didn't know me yet. You were going on what you could see. I decided I'd rather show you than argue with you." Holt made a sound that was half a grunt and half something more complicated. "That's a harder thing to do," he said. "Most of the right things are," she said. He went back to the numbers. That was in its way everything. The school came later. Later, meaning the following autumn, which in the framework of what Clara was building felt like a natural next thing, rather than a leap. There were children in the territory who were receiving no formal education because the distances were too great and the resources too few. She had been aware of this since her first weeks in Billings had noted it, the way she noted everything filed. It returned to it, thought about what could actually be done about it rather than simply what should be done in a theoretical sense. She talked to Wyatt about it in the evenings, the slow-building conversations they had fallen into the habit of having after dinner when the work was done enough that the day could be considered in something approaching peace. He listened with the attention she had come to depend on, not passive listening. Not the listening that is really just waiting for your turn, but actual engagement, his mind working visibly on the problem she was presenting. "The families can't come to town," she said. "The town has to figure out how to go to the families." "A traveling teacher," Wyatt said. "Or multiple, rotating, coordinated, with a curriculum not just whatever whoever's available happens to know." She opened her notebook, the same notebook she had carried from New York, now mostly full, its margins crowded with years of accumulated thought. "I've been working through the logistics." He looked at the notebook. He looked at her. "How long have you been working on this?" he said. "Since November," she said. "Of last year," he said. "Yes." He sat back. He looked at her with that look, the recognition look, the one she had first seen over Douglas's healed leg, the one that meant he was seeing something clearly that he had suspected and was now confirmed. "You've been building this whole time," he said. "I build things," she said simply. "It's what I do." He leaned over and looked at the notebook properly. She turned it toward him. He read in silence for a few minutes, the notes, the logistics, the cost projections, the list of families she had already identified and their children's ages and the rough geographic clusters that would make routing efficient. He looked up. "What do you need?" he said. "Money for the first teacher's salary for 6 months," she said. I'll apply to the Territorial Education Fund for the rest. Dr. Haskell will write a letter of support. Mrs. Granger has already said she'll donate supplies. She paused. I need the ranch to underwrite the first 6 months as a demonstration of community investment. Grant committees respond to that. How much? Wyatt said. She told him. He didn't hesitate. Done, he said. The grant came through by February. The first traveling teacher, a young woman named Agnes, whom Clara had found through the Denver connections and vetted with the precision she brought to everything, began her routes in March. By June 14 children in remote properties who had received no formal education were attending sessions regularly. One of their mothers wrote Clara a letter that she kept in her grandmother's wooden box alongside the scrap of paper that said, "You are more than they see." The letter said, "My daughter told me yesterday that she wants to be a doctor when she grows up. I didn't know how to tell her that it was possible. I don't have to anymore because she already knows your name." Clara read that letter so many times the paper went soft along the fold lines. The article came next. Not the one Elby had written, but a second one from a different paper, longer and more widely distributed, that ran in the summer of Clara's second year in Montana. A national paper this time. The story had grown past what one journalist in Billings had started and become something that moved on its own. The story of the Frontier Medical Program, the traveling school, the ranch that had transformed its finances, the woman at the center of all of it. This article used the phrase that would follow her for the rest of her life. The Queen of the Frontier. She read it at the kitchen table, which was where she read most things, and when she got to that phrase, she stopped and looked at it for a long moment. Pete, who was also at the table, and also reading, she had taught him to appreciate books slowly, and without making it a lesson, looked up at her. "What?" he said. She turned the paper and pointed. He read it. His face broke into a grin that took over his entire head. "Queen of the Frontier," he said. "Clara, that's excessive," she said. "That's great," he said. "It's a newspaper phrase," she said. "It's meant to sell copies. Does it matter why they said it if it's true?" She looked at him. He had grown in 2 years. Not just in age, though, there was that too. The filling out of him from a young man into something more settled. In seriousness. In the particular gravity that comes from watching someone work with full commitment and deciding to bring that same commitment to your own work. He was better at his job than he had been. He asked better questions. He was less afraid of the answers. She thought not for the first time that she had learned as much from the people on this ranch as she had ever taught them. "It matters," she said. "Not the phrase, the truth underneath it." "Which is," Pete said. She thought about it. "That a person's worth isn't decided by the people around them," she said. "It's decided by what they do when they have the chance to do it." Pete looked at her, nodded, went back to his book. She went back to her accounts. The letter from Josephine, a real one. This time, not a telegram. 4 full pages, arrived in August. Clara opened it with the care she had learned to bring to things from her family, not braced, not hopeful, but present, willing to receive whatever was true. Josephine had left New York. She had moved to Philadelphia, where she was working in a hospital, not as a nurse exactly, and not as a doctor, but in the administrative capacity that existed between the two, organizing the records and the staffing and the supply ordering in a way that, from her description, sounded remarkably like what Clara had done with Wyatt's accounts in her first weeks on the ranch. She was, Josephine wrote, carefully good at it. She wrote with the particular surprise of someone discovering a capability they had been told they didn't have better at it than she had expected to be. She had a few people who relied on her. She was not sure yet what she thought about that. She said writing to tell Clara this, not to ask for anything, not to repair anything necessarily. She was honest enough to write that she didn't know if repair was possible or what it would look like. But to say that she understood now in some small way what it felt like to be good at something that mattered. And that understanding it had changed how she thought about the person she had watched be good at things for 28 years without once saying so. At the bottom of the letter in slightly different ink, as though added afterward. "I'm proud of you. I should have said it years ago. I'm saying it now." Clara folded the letter. She sat with it for a long time. Then she opened her grandmother's wooden box and put it inside next to the scrap of paper that said, "You are more than they see," next to the letter from the mother whose daughter now knew her name. She closed the box. She picked up her pen. She wrote back. That evening, Wyatt found her on the porch, which had become their place in the way that certain places become certain people's places, not through decision, but through repetition, through the accumulation of evenings spent there together, becoming a habit that is the same as belonging. He sat beside her. "Good day," he said. She thought about everything the day had contained. The accounts, the letter from Josephine, the report from Agnes about the traveling school, the note from Ruth about a case she had handled successfully 60 miles east alone without anyone doubting her, the ledger that showed the ranch's strongest financial quarter in its history. "Yes," she said. "Tell me one thing about it," he said. It was something he did, asked for one thing, not everything, because he understood the difference between being debriefed and being heard. She thought. "Josephine wrote," she said. "She said she was proud of me." Wyatt was quiet for a moment. "How did that feel?" "Like something arriving very late," she said. "But still arriving." He put his arm around her. She leaned into it, into the solid, real, deliberate weight of him, the man who had met her on a train platform with his hat in his hands and not asked her to be anything other than whoever she was. "Late isn't the same as never," he said. "No," she agreed. "It isn't." They sat in the quiet that was theirs, the specific quality of silence that exists between people who have worked hard together and trusted each other and told each other true things and built something real from nothing much, which is the closest thing to genuine peace that Clara Whitmore had ever known. She thought about the girl on the train. 4 days across the country with a suitcase full of books and a scrap of paper and the absolute minimum of hope required to keep moving. She thought about what that girl had believed, that she was traveling toward another heartbreak, that the best she could do was survive the rejection gracefully. She had been so wrong about what she was traveling toward. She had been traveling toward this porch, this evening, this man, this territory that did not care about her mother's opinion or her family's social calculations or the difference between Josephine's face and hers. This community that knew her name because she had earned the knowing of it one Thursday morning and one account ledger and one healed fracture at a time. She had been traveling toward herself, the version of herself that the house on Gramercy Park had kept carefully covered behind the small room at the end of the hall, behind years of being told that what she was and what she knew and what she could do was not the right kind of thing to be or know or do. Montana had not made her. She had always been made. Montana had simply been the first place willing to let her be it. The wooden box was upstairs. Inside it, 3 things, a scrap of paper in her grandmother's handwriting. A letter from a woman whose daughter now had a name to believe in. A letter from a sister who had finally managed late but real to say the true thing. And tomorrow, there would be more accounts to balance, more supply orders, to review more children in remote properties who needed what Agnes could give them. More women like Ruth who needed someone to sit across from them and say, "You already know this. Let me give you the name for it." More letters to write to Denver. More consortium meetings. More Thursday mornings with Dr. Haskell. More evenings on this porch with this man. More life, in other words. Real, full, complete, chosen life. The woman her family had sent west to be discarded had not been discarded. She had been planted. And what grew from her in the accounts and the medicine and the schools and the people and the community and the love she had built with a man who looked at her and saw clearly and completely and without effort. Exactly who she was not small and was not quiet and was not the kind of thing that a family in New York could reach across 2,000 miles to diminish. It was the kind of thing that lasts. The kind of thing that years from now people would point to and say, "She built that." Not because someone gave her the materials. Not because someone cleared the ground. But because she arrived with nothing except herself, and herself turned out to be more than enough. Clara Whitmore. Clara Callahan was not the bride nobody wanted. She was the woman nobody recognized until she had already become someone the world could not afford to forget. And that was not an accident of circumstance or a gift from the frontier or a kindness from a cowboy who took off his hat on a train platform. That was her. That had always been her. She had simply at last been given room to prove it.